Hello and welcome to this discussion of emerging technologies and the future of work in Africa and the presentation of the report From Subsistence to Disruptive Innovation, Africa, the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Future of Jobs. This event is sponsored by the Africa Growth Initiative of the Global Economy and Development Department at the Brookings Institution. My name is Raj Desai. I am a non-resident senior fellow in the Global Economy Program and a professor of international development at Georgetown University. I also want to welcome all of those who are joining on live from the live stream. If you have questions during this event, you may submit them via Twitter to the hashtag Africa4IR or email your questions to events@brookings.edu. Now, job creation for Africa's youth has, for many years, been one of the major challenges for the region and looks to become increasingly important given the youth bulge and the wave of young Africans entering the job market over the next 2 decades. The possibilities of billions of people connected by mobile devices with unprecedented processing power, storage capacity, access to knowledge are unlimited. And these possibilities will be multiplied by emerging technology breakthroughs in fields such as artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, nanotechnology, biotechnology, material science, energy storage, quantum computing, and so on. These are the technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. For those unfamiliar with the term, the First Industrial Revolution is about water and steam power and mechanization. The second uses electric power and mass production. The third uses electronics and information technology to automate production. Now the Fourth Industrial Revolution is building on the third, a digital revolution that has been occurring since the middle of the last century, characterized by a fusion of technologies blurring the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres. It's against this background that African governments are being advised to organize and invest for this revolution in various ways. In this regard, there seem to be 2 broad challenges. First, there is the challenge of African producers accessing and adopting these new technologies. In the past, unique barriers, high costs, and various risks have limited the spread of some revolutionary technologies, such as the Green Revolution, as well as productivity gains in sub-Saharan Africa. Second, while the adoption of 4IR technologies in sub-Saharan Africa could bring substantial benefits, we also know from history that technological revolutions also bring social and economic disruption, including inequality and social tensions. So the task then lies in the mix of policies that create both a favorable environment for private investment while ensuring that there are robust forms of protection for vulnerable groups. Now let me introduce the distinguished panelists that are joining us today. First, we have Louise Fox. Louise is a non-resident senior fellow in the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Her work at Brookings focuses on youth employment, inclusive growth, and poverty reduction. Her previous positions included Chief Economist at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She is also a visiting professor of development economic policy at the University of California at Berkeley and a visiting fellow at the Blum Center at Berkeley. Louise is also a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and on the advisory board of the G7 Inclusive Growth Financing Forum. During her very long career at the World Bank, Louise advised governments in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe on how to develop, implement, and evaluate policies for employment, social security, and poverty reduction. Next, we have Landry Signé. Landry is a senior fellow in the Global Economy Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative. He was previously a David Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings. His career and research spanned the areas of global political economy, global governance, sustainable development, global business and emerging markets, strategic management and leadership, fragility, state capacity, policy implementation, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He's a professor and founding co-director of the Globalization 4.0 and Fourth Industrial Revolution Initiative at the Thunderbird School of Global Management and a distinguished fellow at Stanford University's Center for African Studies. Signé was also a visiting scholar and has taught at Oxford, Stanford, Georgetown, Montreal, Ottawa, Witwatersrand, as well as the Sub-Regional Institute of Statistics and Applied Economics in Central Africa, as well as the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University and HEC Paris School of Management. Finally, we have Justice Tei Mensah. Justice Tei Mensah is an economist in the Office of the Chief Economist, Africa region at the World Bank. Prior to this position, he was an economist at the International Finance Corporation. His research, policy, and operational work cover a range of policy-relevant questions related to infrastructure, development, and public policy in Africa. Specifically, his research recently focuses on digital technologies, energy, firms, and private sector development. Justice has a PhD in economics from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, an MPhil in economics from the University of Ghana, and a bachelor's in economics from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage the first presenter, Louise Cox. Please come to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, Raj. And I just want to say how happy I am to be here at Brookings today and to speak with you all. And my co-author and I, Landry, and I really look forward to having an engaging conversation about this topic. I think we've been working on this research for maybe a year and a half or so, and so we really are happy to be able to discuss it with you today. All right, so what exactly am I presenting? Well, this is a research paper, and it has a research question, right? There's been a lot written about the fourth industrial revolution in Africa. You know, it's social, political, economic, business, all kinds of implications. We wanted to focus on the implications for employment, given the salience of that issue. And our contribution in this paper is we brought together a new conceptual framework on how to think about this within the African context, different from the ones that have been used by others, such as McKinsey and others that have written about this topic. And the second thing is we also, we use that framework to basically do a literature review, okay? And so we didn't do a lot of new research for this. A lot of it was based on our interpretation of existing research. And we wanted to do an analysis sector by sector to look at the point of view of the producer, okay? Because I think the real question, and then we want to look at the issues for public policy. Now, why do we start with the point of view of the producer? Well, producers either hire themselves in the informal sector, farms and firms, or they get hired by somebody else. So it's the producer that makes the decisions which then inform employment. And we think the issue for Africa is not disruption, the way such great scholars such as Darren Acemoglu have looked at it for the US and others for Europe and advanced economies. So we think the real issue is adaptation. So we don't really, the question, is there a value proposition, right, for producers? Really, most analysis assumes the technology will be adopted. So there's all this stuff about how this is a silver bullet for all these problems in Africa. But nobody looks at, from the producer's point of view, could they adopt the technology? And so we focus on, and also we focus on the informal sector. Because remember, 50% of employment in Africa is on informal farms and firms. So we think leaving that sector out in any discussion of fourth industrial revolution technology is a very, it just ignores really what's really happening in employment in Africa. Okay, so what's our framework? Why would technology not be adopted? As Raj explained so clearly, this technology is dynamic. It's transforming all kinds of fields. It's bringing all kinds of new ways of doing. And remember, technology adoption is what creates sustainable development, right? Because new technology allows producers to be more productive, allowing the transformation of the economy, okay? And, right? So why wouldn't it be adopted? Okay, so there are several reasons. The producer's problem, right? If I'm either starting a business, or I'm running a business, or I'm running my farm, or whatever, is how to be productive, sell more stuff, and make more profits, right? That's my simple, easy problem, okay? I will adopt technology if it solves that problem, okay? So why wouldn't it solve the problem? Well, in many cases, the risks aren't really the risk-adjusted rewards. So the risks are high, so the risk-adjusted rewards might not be high enough to justify the investment. For example, remember all of this technology is being invented in the US and Europe and Japan, right? In rich countries. And when technology is invented in rich countries, it's designed to solve rich country problems, right? And so, for example, a lot of it may be labor saving, right? But labor saving doesn't really help in a context where labor is abundant. So maybe it might not help me produce things cheaper so that I can make more and sell more and make more profits, okay? The second thing is it might be too costly. Remember, technology comes with patents. Technology is embodied in capital and machines and increasingly in digital codes, right? That's really the heart of 4AR technology is all of this, for example, biology and physical processes embedded in software. But you've got to have the electronics and the software, and it may be too expensive. So I can't get beyond the patent protections, for example, to adopt these new CRISPR-developed seeds or whatever. Then also, maybe I can't get the complementary inputs, right? Maybe, first of all, if I'm going to run even third industrial revolution technology, which is digital, I've got to have electricity. And I've got to have, and for fourth industrial revolution technology, I need electricity of a good enough quality, right? I can't have these interruptions in the middle of my 3D printing because it's going to gum up the printer with all this plastic goop and my product will be destroyed and I have to start over, right? So maybe I need air conditioning for my cloud computing servers. All of these things are really important and maybe I just can't get them, okay? Maybe I can't get the skills, right, to fix the machines. I can bring in the machine. I don't know how to fix the machine. I can't get the skills to fix the machines, okay? And maybe it just doesn't fix what's my binding constraint. So if I'm a farmer, and my constraint, for example, is more land or water, more information about prices doesn't help me. I need more land and water, right? A drone that can spray all the trees around for pests is great, but if I can't make enough money off my tree crops to pay for that drone to come and spray, even though it can do it much, much better than I can't afford it. And finally, a lot of times technology is about a new product. Remember how many new products have come into the market? You know, just in the last 30 years. I mean, just think about mobile phones. That's a new product, right? And everything that comes from mobile phones and all of the Internet of Things and all of these Internet available devices, okay? But if I can't find a domestic or international market for that, I can't produce it, okay? So that's my final point. Now, so stepping back from that problem, where do we think fourth industrial technology could help? First of all, we think technology will create better jobs. We think the answer is yes, but the producer incentives have to be right, okay, to get the technology adopted. So our view of the overall impact is modest, a modest increase. And we do think it will help both the formal and the informal sectors. All right, but the long-standing obstacles to production upscaling in Africa, which have hindered this already, will reduce adoption, and this will reduce the growth effort, and it will mute the employment disruption. And I think how to encourage adoption is what Landry's going to talk about in the second part of this talk. All right, so let's just talk about a few sectors. Agriculture, okay, first of all, employment's going to contract in agriculture, and we want that, right? Because it's, the lowest productivity sector, and that's part of structural transformation, right? Is people moving out of agriculture and being pulled into new and better jobs with more earning, right? So, but we are pessimistic, even for those who remain in agriculture, that it will be adopted. It has been successfully adopted outside of Africa, both digital technology and fourth industrial revolution technology in Asia. But in Africa, we really actually don't have good examples of scale up, right? And the reason is the fundamentals are still a problem, right? African agriculture actually still hasn't adopted 20th century technology like fertilizer. There's very low use of fertilizer in Africa. And and that's because of a lot of outstanding issues around market structure, around land rights, a lot of different things. It's a complicated issue, but it needs work. And so if anybody tells you that fourth industrial revolution will be the silver bullet for African agriculture, I suggest that they really need to look carefully at what the evidence that we see is about technology adoption in agriculture. Now, in manufacturing, that, of course, is where this technology is the most controversial because it's labor saving. But it's also quality enhancing. That is the problem for African manufacturing. It's also quality enhancing. So in order to compete with imports and perhaps export, even within the continent, it will have to be adopted. It won't solve many employment problems, but if it allows manufacturing in Africa to expand, it can bring, for example, non-operational jobs. So manufacturing isn't just operational jobs. The goods have to get out of the factory, and they have to, they have to get around the country, et cetera, et cetera. So, so we think there are some opportunities here. And I would highlight for just a second 3D printing, right? Because manufacturing has economies of scale, and that's something that's really hindered small African countries from being competitive in manufacturing because they can't get a scale to get their goods to markets. But 3D printing doesn't have scale. And so this could be a real opportunity for African-designed products for an internal market or a regional market. And that will lead into a whole discussion of the regional market and how to make it work better. But I'm quite optimistic about 3D printing. The final sector is the service sectors. Now, we have the formal service sector, right? That's people who work in offices or who work in the tourism sector or who work for companies that employ them to drive trucks or handle logistics or whatever. We have the informal service sector, okay? The informal service sector in transportation is the people that drive motorcycles, bodas, right? Or they may run, they may do taxis, or they delivering stuff, right? And delivering people and stuff and whatever. They also are the informal people who sell stuff in markets, on the streets, all over the place. They're the people that fix stuff. You know, when your mobile phone is broken in Africa, often you go to somebody on a street corner or in a market in a little place over here. You don't go to T-Mobile and say, "Fix my phone," right? They run small restaurants, bars, shops, little kiosks, whatever. And so this is these people are the ones. This is where employment has been expanding. Employment has been expanding there because, as with other continents, it takes time to expand formal sector employment. You need more capital to employ people formally than informally. So as the labor force grows, some are absorbed formally, and the rest do informal employment, right? So, so we don't think the share of informal employment will go down very quickly in Africa. And so technology won't create enough formal sector jobs to really just suck everybody out of the informal sector, not at least for the next 20 years, and who knows after that, what's going on. So, but we do think we do see evidence, lots of evidence, that where ICT services are affordable, informal sector operators gain income through better connection with customers and suppliers. And fintech also, of course, has been a real benefit because they don't have to use so much cash, so they're not subject to the dangers of having cash. And Uber-type systems in transports are bringing higher earnings and more security. So we see evidence, but that's only in countries that have made the internet affordable, remember? Or have made mobile telephony affordable. You know, there's just a new report out. I was reading Quartz Africa this morning. There's just a new report out on the cost on internet download speeds in Africa. Oh my God. The number of countries that are in single digits. You know, I'm in triple digits at home on a good day. Let me just say, on a good day. But the number of countries that are in single digits, and then they pay like so much more money for their internet than I pay. You know, but this is a policy problem. This can be fixed. And my colleague, Landry Signé, is going to tell you all about that. Okay. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here, but just what? Minimize. Okay. Landry, you can come up. I'm really not sure how I minimize this.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Louise. Hello, everyone. So I'm pleased to be part of this panel today to further discuss the implications of the fourth industrial revolution in Africa related to job and to the economy. So the first point I would like to make is related to the complexity brought by the fourth industrial revolution. Raj spoke about the fusion of technologies, blurring the frontier between the physical, the biological, and the digital world, as defined by the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. And an additional dimension here is the velocity. So with the fourth industrial revolution, things are evolving with an incredible speed. But you also have the scope. All the sectors are affected globally in Africa. Some sectors are more affected than others. And finally, the system impact. Whether people are involved or not, they remain affected. So this leads us also to the question of inclusion among others. So, and just to avoid people being perhaps misunderstanding our broader message, we are quite enthusiastic about the potential that the fourth industrial revolution can bring in Africa. So we are enthusiastic, and we think that in order for this potential to be fully realized, policymakers have to adopt the right options. So as Louise explained, so the impact will be heterogeneous. For example, the service sector will be one of the most affected, and many of you already are aware about the work done on industries without smokestacks at the Brookings Institution, ICT-based industry, service-based industry, among other, which have similar characteristics like traditional manufacturing, whether we speak about the exportability, so we speak about the fact that they are labor-intensive, they absorb a huge quantity of moderately skilled workers, among other. So, and I mentioned this because it is extremely important to bear in mind that, for example, in the late 90s, New York City had more mobile phone subscribers than the entire continent of Africa. So if productive technological adoption is not as widespread as it is necessary, so we see the consumption one which is quite high. So one of the challenges will be to translate those from a consumption to a productive use of technology. And of course, before moving to the challenges, so I also want to just highlight also the fact that we think that technology overall will be important, the fourth industrial revolution in my order, in unlocking the economic potential, growth, structural transformation as well, but depending on the sectors, some more pronounced than other, will have an impact on skills, also in terms of inclusive technology. So the dimension that we should be thinking about, how can we have inclusive fourth industrial revolution technologies? So the technologies which are dominant in other parts of the world may not always be the ones which are the most appropriate for in some of the sectors in Africa. So innovation, disruption will also be necessary there. So now, what are some of the challenges faced by African countries when we speak about the fourth industrial revolution, especially as it relates also to job creation? Governance. Governance is an extremely important question. The inadequacy of regulation and also the overall business environment. As a matter of fact, the fourth industrial revolution is a private sector-led revolution. In advanced economies, so you see the speed, I mentioned velocity. Even in advanced economy, government have difficulties to regulate at a speed which will match what the private sector will be doing. So that is a key dimension, and how can Africa unlock, our African countries unlock the business environment, how to ensure that regulators will be more nimble. So those are some of the dimensions which will really be important. And related to that dimension of governance, so one of the solutions, of course, will be not just to address the costs for doing business, to remove regulatory barriers among others, but also to adopt agile governance. So agile governance is an approach which allows to bridge the gap between the innovation speed of the private sector, but also the ability of government to ensure that those innovations are properly regulated, so that incentives to continue to innovate remain present, while ensuring also that those innovations also serve the greater good. So that dimension, extremely important, the governance dimension. And governance is also critical because it facilitates, it's an important driver to investment, to private investment, regulatory quality, the ease of doing business, the cost of doing business. So that is one of the key dimensions. A second dimension is really, a second challenge is really the gap in both physical and digital infrastructure. Of course, recently some number were being circulated about $100 billion of infrastructure gap on the continent. But this is probably an incredibly conservative number, because if we think about the type of infrastructure that we have, for example, in the United States, and if you have to build those infrastructure on the continent, I think $100 billion of deficit of gap is an understatement. And when we speak about infrastructure, we speak about internet access as well. So we speak about the importance of including the gender dimension. To what extent women will have similar type of access that we also have for men, for example. And what can we do about infrastructure? Who can do what? First, again, we also have a question of enabling environment and creating a conducive environment by African leaders to attract private investors. But international financial institutions should also heavily invest in closing infrastructure gap, leading the financing of infrastructure, which will help facilitate also private investment as well. So the third dimension that we also want to highlight is related to human capital, inclusive skill development for technology adoption. But when you think about human capital, quite often policymakers will only be thinking about tertiary education, about training the highly skilled worker in specific area of relevant to the fourth industrial revolution. I must say that it is important, and our research has shown that, to take into consideration primary and secondary education to build those critical skills, critical thinking, but also basic digital skills if the goal is also to address inequality and to create the conducive environment to attract more private investment in the tertiary education. So this is another dimension which is extremely important. So now, probably as a final point that I would like to make, it is extremely important for African countries, and of course we have different speed. We have the leaders of the fourth industrial revolution which include Mauritius, South Africa, among others. We have the follower, and you have laggards, so like countries such as Chad, for example, or the Central African Republic. So it's really important when we speak about sub-Saharan Africa or about Africa in general to understand that different countries have various speed and have adopted various strategies, and some are leading the way, while we also have laggards. So, but it is critical for government to adopt a comprehensive strategy with some of the following points. It should be a whole-encompassing government approach. All the sectors of the economy should be included in those sectors. The fourth industrial revolution is not just about technology, and it's not just about specific industries. It's about how could government adopt a holistic approach which will bring multi-stakeholder collaboration across ministry, agencies, national and sub-national governments, among others. The second point is really how to maximize growth, transformation, and inclusion. And for this, it's really important to stimulate new technologies and foster private sector innovation. So without the private sector, it is impossible to have an inclusive fourth industrial revolution. So widening access to technology throughout the continent will therefore be extremely important. And finally, it is important for policymakers to really think about delivery. It's not just about adopting specific strategies. It's also about bridging the gap between policy intention and implementation outcomes. So many countries and the continent, because we have both a national approach but also a continental approach, do not just need a new strategy, a new roadmap. What is extremely important is to bridge that gap between the speed, the velocity of the fourth industrial revolution and the ability of those governments to create the conducive environment to really address the challenges that we have just mentioned. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And now, Justice, if you can join us.
So, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to comment on this report. So I think it's, I must commend the authors for certain a very insightful report in the sense that, and I found it quite interesting, at least on 4 dimensions. Reading through the report, you get a sense of the diagnostic of the state of the adoption of these technologies within the continent, right? And not just focusing on the 4th industrial revolution technologies, but also they do mention that there are even some challenges with the adoption of the 3rd generation, like industrial revolution technologies, and which is because still up to today, there's still a lot of many African countries where access to internet is still a luxury, quote and unquote, right? But then it also gives us a sense of what are some of the constraints that many of these countries are going to face if they are able to scale up the adoption of these technologies, right? And here, it's essentially, and I like the portion, especially on the agriculture, where, the report basically highlights that there are certain inherent structural constraints that needs to be fixed if these countries are going to be able to increase the uptake of these technologies within the agriculture sector as well as other sectors. Again, it highlights some that is not it's not all rosy, right? It's not as if that everyone or every sector is automatically going to gain out of it. There are going to be some gainers, but there are also some sectors that might not necessarily gain if the current structure still remains. And then they end with some policy options. In addition, the report also asks some tough questions, right? For instance, is it going to be inclusive, right? Because for a very long time, economists have always argued that, okay, rollout adoption of technologies is good. It's good for the aggregate outcomes, but how do you ensure that all parties benefit, right? In the sense that these technologies, in as much as we are praising it, we see the potential effect. We don't end up creating or exacerbating the inequality challenges in society. And then he says, I think at the end of it all, my sense was that the authors also argue that there's no silver bullet to addressing these challenges. It's not as if that just go and roll out subsidies to everybody and everybody will adopt it and that's the end. It needs a coordinated plan. And it needs a mix of policies both on the infrastructure space, governance, education, etc. And these are things that I really liked about the report. Now, what are some of my personal takeaways from it, right, in terms of policy takeaways? What I understood and why I think it's quite important for African countries. Essentially, this report, and together with many other reports, highlights that access to infrastructure, both digital and analog, is critical for development. Now, there's a reason why countries like South Africa seems to be a top performer when it comes to uptake of these technologies, because it seems to have the best of infrastructure, both analog, physical, and digital, right? And so there's an efficient form of transportation that allows the logistics subsector to be able to thrive. So if African countries are going to be able to do well with these industrial revolution technologies, we cannot just leapfrog, the basic of infrastructure. These infrastructure needs to be in place, because once these infrastructure are in place, it affects the bottom line of businesses. It reduces cost of doing business and private sector is able to thrive. And Landry mentioned that these technologies are really private sector led, right? And so if African countries will be able to be successful in increasing the uptake of these, having access to or investment into these technologies, infrastructure is going to be good. The second point relates to skills, right? Technology, it requires skills. Now, how will we be able to ensure that the massive population on the continent are able to use these technologies? Then, essentially, and the report actually calls for a reform of our educational system so that we don't just focus on investment into tertiary education, because if you want people to do STEM at secondary and at the universities, the primary schools needs to be better equipped to be able to teach the students the skills they need, the foundational literacy, to be able to equip them with the skills that will be able to do this. And so it calls for a proper reform of our educational system, and also much more investment into STEM education. But also, I also think that the way these policies should be done shouldn't necessarily focus on just people who are currently in school. The people who have exited school might need some retraining, right? There's always an opportunity for skills upgrade. I know people who probably didn't do any course in school that's related to tech, right? But they are actually learning machine learning now because there are opportunities, online courses that allows them to be able to do that. And so government should not only focus on those that are currently in school, but also have opportunities for skills upgrading. The last point on the terms of the policy takeaway is that it calls for strategic planning. And in other words, for this to be successful, there needs to be a lot of coordination across various sectors. And government needs to have a proper planning in terms of how to do this, not just focus on one sector but recognize the interlinkages between, say, for instance, the educational sector and then the industrial sector, so that as we roll out educational programs, there's sort of a feedback loop to ensure that the graduates that are churning out of the institutions are even relevant for the job market. Now, in spite of these, I have a couple of questions for the authors. The first one relates to cost, right? Because oftentimes, we tend to write a lot of reports and say, hey, A, B, C, D, and E are good for the continent. And oftentimes, when people are experts in a particular field, they always say, oh, government, adopt this and you'll be fine. But we tend to ignore the cost, right, of these things. The question is, we all know that many African countries are struggling to raise enough revenue, right? And the little revenue they have, they still have a plethora of needs to be able to look out for, right? To be able to meet, the needs of these. At the moment, even access to the third industrial revolution technologies is still low. So in spite of all the good things or the benefits that these fourth industrial revolution technologies are likely to bring, countries have a tough choice. They need to make some trade-offs, right? Maybe they might have to curtail some of their investment into health to be able to invest into the infrastructure that these technologies need. How much should governments to be looking out here, right? And these are tough choices that I think probably we should begin to think about these and see. Related to that, of course, if you're going to make any of these choices, it's political, right? Because if you're going to switch resources, financing from some other sectors to another, it comes with a political cost. And oftentimes, policymakers are cognizant. I think one of the key elements in the objective function of a policymaker is what is the political implication of what I'm doing, right? Because if it leads to people on the streets, probably the government might want to think twice about that. But even aside that, one of the recommendations, like I mentioned earlier, that I like was the need for coordinated effort, right? Bringing different sectors together. But that requires a lot of political will. In many African countries, we see countries draw up strategies and development plans, 10-year, 5-year, 20-year, that are never implemented, right? The reason is that there's often not enough political will or enough political buy-in. And by a political will and buy-in here, I'm not just referring to the will of the current government, but even, buy-in from the opposition, because after a while, the government might not be the current government might not necessarily be in power, right? What if you start something and tomorrow another government comes and scraps everything and started a new one? There's the need for us to incorporate some of these implications, political economy implications in the policy discourse of these things. The next point is, and so I read a report and I like the emphasis on inclusion, but it seems to more or less give less emphasis to TVET education, technical, vocational training and education. But I think that one way of probably addressing the inclusion issue is that we need to take a second look at how our TVET education is done. Because this is one part of education that has the potential to employ a lot of the masses, right? It doesn't necessarily generate a very high-skilled job, but a medium-skilled job that could employ a lot of the people. Because we all know that not everybody is going to benefit from the high-skilled jobs that these fourth industrial revolution technologies are going to bring. But then, the medium-skills jobs, equipping people with technical skills will be able to help them to be able to have something doing, and they will also be able to produce services that in the end might leverage some of these technologies. And that I think that probably, it might be an expensive thing to do, but I think it's something worthwhile for African governments to think about, right? And that the current system of the TVET education in many African countries is not working because a lot of the time the incentives are switched. So in Ghana, for example, we focus so much on grammar education, but the problem with that is that you generate a lot of people from the universities that there are not enough jobs for them to do. But maybe taking a second look at TVET education could be good, right, for these countries. The last point I'd like to highlight on is having a digital ecosystem for African tech entrepreneurs. I often read a lot of these reports in this space, and sometimes I think that the narrative seems to be that many people in this country should just be consumers, right, of these technologies. But my challenge is that, I tend to have an opinion on that. I think that it is important for governments in these countries to not only see their citizens as just going to be consumers of these technologies or users of these technologies, but also create the necessary ambience for the tech enthusiasts in these countries to also become developers, right? And this will require having technology parks for young people that they will be able to go there and learn about these things. And also having a bridge between academia and industry, right? Many of the time, our investors are often detached from the industry, but having a bridge between them will be very good for many of these countries to really benefit from this tech revolution. So I would like to stop here and thank the organizers again for inviting me. And let me hand over to Raj now. Thanks.
Thank you, Justice. I would invite all the panelists to the stage and for the discussion. And just to remind everyone who's online, again, the questions can be submitted by the Twitter handle hashtag Africa4IR, or email to events, EVENTS, @brookings.edu. Thank you, everyone. That was a great presentation, great set of comments. So let me start with something that Justice mentioned towards the end there with his remarks, which is about the difficulty of shifting from the dominant sectors in sub-Saharan African economies today to sectors that are more suitable for 4IR technology. So, as you know, most African exporters are primary product exporters. And in addition to the political barriers, there are presumably some structural barriers of the transition, including the, for example, problems of escaping Dutch disease and other issues with regards to dependence on primary product exports. So how do you see the fourth industrial revolution technologies, as well as government policies, helping to overcome that?
Well, I guess I can start on that point. I have to say, by the way, Dutch disease is a political economic problem, and technology doesn't solve it. So we need to be clear about what technology can do and not do. Now, however, non-mineral exporters in Africa actually have diversified their exports a lot. And we see that, especially in countries like Ghana and Tanzania and Kenya. We see a lot of diversification. And so, in particular, those countries, this technology offers a real chance to really raise the exports of services. Tourism is a service export. And it creates a lot of good jobs, and it can be expanded and create even more good jobs. E-commerce is really expanding. And I think with the expansion of e-commerce and the development of inter-Africa payment systems, I think that there can be a lot more intra-African trade, which can actually work to the benefit of producers who want to adopt this technology and are looking for a market. And I think that's especially true of sort of custom and high-end products, like which is what?
Excuse me,
sorry.
I think I think something bumped your pocket. It's not working.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I apologize. I don't have to start over, though, do I?
I think we were just having difficulty hearing you because your microphone turned off in your pocket. So just continue as you were talking.
Okay.
I think we might have had a hard time hearing.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. But anyway, I just want to say the expansion of the services industry, as Brookings has been, in the forefront of discussing how to expand the service industry to create better jobs. I think that's where we see 4IR technology possibly being adopted and spurring on experts. But having said that, this is what I always say: the informal will be normal because structural transformation takes time. But it has to be encouraged, and that's where we've got to go. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Louise, for this. And perhaps just an element that I want to add here in the context of the adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Area. By 2050, the combined consumer and business spending on the continent may reach about 16 trillion of US dollar. So, a key element goes beyond the, so to trade, you need to produce. So I think that is a strategy that has been extensively discussed during the United Nations General Assembly. Last week, we have engagement with the friend of the African Continental Free Trade Area organized by the World Economic Forum and the AFCFTA. So it's really important to produce first. And some areas having identified which are somewhat related to a certain extent to the 4IR. So one, for example, the automotive sector. So it's important to build the infrastructure as well. So we speak about agriculture and agri-industry. And finally, we speak also about pharmaceutical. So those are some of the areas where you have plans which are already developed. And ultimately, the challenge is not just related to the sector in which the fourth industrial revolution will be relevant or not, but instead to the overall directions that the African economies will be adopting, whether in the primary, in the secondary, or the tertiary sector, because the scope is not just limited to technology.
So this raises the question of the role of the government in terms of government policies. So you spent a lot of time speaking about the nature of the regulatory environment and the need to improve the investment climate, the environment for business. And I guess the question is, what should the proper role of government be in facilitating this revolution? So there's a little bit of I guess, a thin line between regulatory reforms and other changes that lower the costs of the administrative costs, particularly red tape, barriers, things like that. Between that and more what I would call industrial policy, where you are actually incentivizing investment to flow to sectors where private investors would not, without those incentives, invest. So where do you stand on this, on where the proper role of government should be when it comes to facilitating this transition?
That's yours, Landry.
So, yes, I think the governments across the continent, but also continentally, should play a prominent role in creating an enabling environment, conducive environment, and not just to specific industry, but the broader ease of doing business. And I think Justice highlighted the political economy question, which is extremely important. To what extent government policies in some countries, or of course, I want to bring a nuance, because when the ease for doing business by the World Bank was still existing, about 50% of the top 10 most improved countries were located on the continent. Mm-hmm. So governments understand that without an enabling environment, it will be incredibly complex and difficult to really attract private sector investor, whether nationally or globally. So the first thing that government should do is really to create that enabling environment. The second thing is to develop proper policy, proper industrial policy, proper trade policy. We also have regional integration. So we have initiatives which were adopted, the African Continental Free Trade Area. However, it's important for those initiatives not to just remain initiatives. They have to be actually implemented, which brings me perhaps to the other dimension, which is agility. Agility is critical, and this is not just in the context of emerging technologies or in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. Perhaps the emerging technologies and the context of the fourth industrial revolution demonstrate the need for governments to do much better, to act faster, to be more effective, but also to be more inclusive. So I think government should really stick to some of those key areas. and of course, the role that they should be playing in terms of human capital, in terms of basic education, primary education, secondary education. Because when we speak about tertiary education and high-skilled worker, to reach there, people should first get primary and secondary education. Plus, if the goal is also to reduce inequality, of course, some of the areas in the tertiary sector are also aligned or could be aligned with some top priorities of government. But if the goal is also to actually reduce inequality, it is important to also address or train those young people who, for most of them, will be self-employed.
So you raise an interesting point, human capital, and this is related to a question that Justice mentioned, which is the emphasis on STEM versus TVET, technical, vocational education and training. One of the online questions submitted prior to the event asks, what are the implications for educational systems in preparing for 4IR? What is your view in terms of whether there is a need for greater emphasis on TVET as part of the ecosystem?
So maybe I can answer that. I think, first of all, what's the role of government? Landry answered very eloquently, but I would say be careful with your money. Always get the best value for money. Public resources are very limited. And in this area, and this may be something Justice wants to address as well, there's a lot of need for infrastructure. There's a lot of opportunities for private financing. And government's role should be to encourage as much of that private financing as possible and save public. It's not on? Hey, what's going on? There we go. Let me start. Sorry. The role of government should be to get value for money. And government needs to be very tight with its money and make sure it's only financing things the private sector wouldn't finance. A lot of this infrastructure, the private sector will finance, okay? And so what government needs to do, as Landry eloquently explained, is to put the incentives in place and the regulatory framework in place so that the private sector will finance it. And it can finance it and make rewards. At the same time, the regulatory structure needs to encourage, as Landry said, inclusion. So basic internet packages, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the role of government. That's especially important in education. Okay? So Africa overall is behind in getting its students through primary and secondary education compared with its competitors around the world. And the problem with that is that once people enter the labor force, leave the education system and enter the labor force, they're in for 40 years, or maybe 50. So those first years, those years matter a lot. And that's, in my view, where the public sector emphasis and financing needs to be. It needs to be getting everybody a higher quality primary education, including some initial efforts at digital skills. And it needs to get everybody through secondary education. And their digital skills are much more important. And I think there are some needs for some specialized skills in the private sector in adopting these technologies, but I think it will be extremely important for African countries to look for public-private partnerships between African universities in rich countries, private sector, because this can open whole new avenues for expanding access to STEM education without utilizing so much of those very scarce public resources which are needed for private and secondary education where we don't see the private sector financing very much. Now, Justice, you asked a good question. Why not TVET? Well, again, let's go back to my point about value for money, okay? TVET costs 4 to 6 times as much as secondary education. TVET is mostly secondary and some post-secondary. And some of the post-secondary TVET is even more expensive than tertiary. And you know what? It doesn't deliver value for money. The private returns to people who go to TVET are in other words, their increased earnings are about the same as the private returns to people to another year of secondary education. So it's delivering the same, for 4 times as much, it's delivering about the same value. I would like to see secondary education try to incorporate more of those basic digital skills so everybody gets it, so you don't have to go to some specialized place. I would also like to see secondary education incorporate more of what we call employability skills. These have to do with soft skills and project working in teams and problem solving, etc. So that's where I would like to see education systems go. And that's what we really see in using these technologies, especially in the service sectors. All those communication skills, soft skills, are super important in terms of utilizing this technology effectively for profit.
Justice, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just a quick reaction. So at the moment, right, so, and I agree, technical education tends to be more expensive than the traditional grammar education, right? But at the moment, we see there's huge unemployment in many African countries. And if you look at the current educational system, once many people finish high school, they don't have enough relevant skills for them to be employed, right? And given that the formal sector is not really that expanded. So my point is that it might be expensive for governments to train TVET education, but the returns in terms of solving the unemployment problem might be greater than the current practice where too much investment is made into grammar, secondary type of education, and then still we end up producing people. They might go to universities, but they still come back home. We have massive graduate unemployment on the continent. The point where I agree with you is that the current TVET structure we have in many countries is not working, but that calls for reforms. But I don't think that because of that, if we argue mainly because of the cost, the government should focus on the secondary education. I think the ripple effect of having too many unemployed people in the country could be greater than the cost of probably investing into the education.
So let me tell you who has the highest unemployment in African countries. It's people from tertiary education. But what I would say is I think it would be much cheaper to reform secondary education so that people didn't have to go to TVET. That would be a much cheaper way to go and much more inclusive. So I think we agree in general on the need for a certain set of skills, and I think we need to have some more discussions about what's the most efficient way to get it. That's what I would say.
Why don't we open to some questions from those who are online?
Sure, thank you. This is Katie from Communications, and I'll just read out a few of the questions that we're starting to get in. First question is from Nora at the MasterCard Foundation, and she's asking, what is your perspective on how sustainability will impact and be impacted by fourth industrial revolution technologies in Africa?
So, this seems like a question for me. So in a piece that I have, which will be released probably sometime by the end of the year, so I address some of those questions of sustainability. And it is clear that the fourth industrial revolution provide the opportunity. Many of the emerging technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution provide a unique opportunity to rethink some aspect of growth from a green growth perspective, from the enabling the sectors of the economy which will be more aligned with sustainability. So I think the potential to positively affect various sectors of the economies in a way which will be aligned with sustainability is very high. Plus, emerging technology associated with the fourth industrial revolution are also playing a key role in related to question related to climate change. How do you related to agriculture? So the big challenge is not whether they have an impact or no, but whether policymaker and the private sector will work together to realize that positive impact on sustainability.
Okay, Raj? Okay. Any other, do we have another?
We go to 12:15.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Please.
I know there's a lot of questions submitted in advance, but I'll keep going with some new live questions. Dr. Surya is asking, modernizing the education system and implementation and enforcement of rule of law and policies for growth of innovation and entrepreneurship is what we have to put our money in. What is the carrot that we want to show for governments to take these measures?
Okay, Landry, that's yours.
Can you restate the question?
Sure. So this question is just asking, what is the carrot for government to get government to invest in innovation, entrepreneurship, and education?
Well, government almost do not have the if I may say this, when you even look at Africa taken as a continent, less than 3% of export are the continent represents less than 3% of global export. Now, when you look, and that's one of the reasons why the African Continental Free Trade Area was created, when you look at trade between Africa and the rest of the world, about 17% of the products which are traded are the ones which are transformed, so are manufactured products. And when you compare intra-African trade, over 40% of those products are transformed. So I think innovation is a necessity on the continent. So there's no alternative to build an inclusive, sustainable economy on the continent without creating that conducive environment. It's also related to job creation. So SMEs are responsible for about 80% of job creation on the continent. And if those could not innovate, and we have had this conversation, Louise, extensively. Do we speak about adaptation? Do we speak about innovation? To what extent? But innovation could come in many forms. You have first adaptation of the existing innovation. So that is typically a first step that countries, including China, for example, went through. And then you have disruptive innovation themselves. So I think that innovation is really critical, and government, as a matter of fact, understand that imperative. The challenge for some is perhaps it could be the group of the vested interest of, especially in countries which are less representative, where leaders are less representative of the will of the people. So that's where you have more challenges. But some of the most innovators on the continent will include countries such as Mauritius and South Africa, among others. So you can clearly also see that some of the fastest growing African countries, or not necessarily fastest growing, but some of the countries where you have more advanced progress in terms of economic growth, in terms of economic transformation, are also some of the most innovative countries. And most African political leaders will be the first to speak about innovation, but now the challenge is to work their talk.
Yeah.
Can we turn to some questions about the social consequences of 4IR? So we have a series of questions that were submitted regarding the effects of 4IR technologies on social disruption. One question, for example, is how would you respond to the argument that the use of technology, which fosters efficiency, productivity gains, tends to lead to downsizing of employees in some existing sectors, yet on the continent a major concern is persistent youth unemployment?
Well, I can speak to that. Well, first of all, let me just, it's on, right? No? Is it on now?
The green dot is on, it's on.
Okay, It's blinking. I don't know what to do. It's blinking. Okay, I got it. Sorry. First of all, let me just quickly speak to the point that African youth unemployment is not actually that high. Many other countries have higher youth unemployment. The real problem is underemployment and low earnings. That is the problem that we need to fix. Now, there is no question that in countries, new technology, especially advanced robotics and some of these other things, have been disruptive to jobs. The jobs that they've been most disruptive to actually mostly don't exist in Africa. So we're not so worried about that. But there is also no question that if Africa does not adopt new technology, it will not be able to create better jobs for those youth who want better jobs. So there is really no choice. And I think what's important is to, as we have stressed all along, is to make sure that it's inclusive, to make sure that people working in the informal sector have access to this technology, so we're not widening inequality and making things less inclusive. Finally, let me say, during the whole period in Europe and the US of more robots and advanced robotics being deployed, as well as other aspects of 4th industrial revolution technology, unemployment it has reached an all-time low. Why did that happen? Okay, some people lost jobs, but in other industries, more jobs were created. A lot of jobs were created. So it's not true that because certain tasks might be eliminated, you don't create more jobs, right? If you make something, somebody has to drive it, right, out of the factory, and there has to be a whole logistics sector to get it to the customer. So that, for example, while some jobs may be lost, other jobs in logistics and e-commerce are growing. And e-commerce, you know, is the way to support the SME sector. It's really important.
So I think in the few minutes we have left, maybe we can broaden out the discussion and try to understand what external stakeholders can do, such as regional bodies, foreign governments, multilateral institutions, as well as multinational corporations. What would you provide as far as guidelines or advice on how these entities can form partnerships to adapt new technological innovations?
So this is
mentioned the infrastructure gap as a big part of that, but are there other areas that can be facilitated?
Absolutely, and we have different. So, but let me start with the infrastructure, because without infrastructure, there's almost no 4th industrial revolution. So it is infrastructure are critical. Investing in infrastructure is critical. So I think that is one of the dimensions, financing infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure. So that is one thing which could be done by both multilaterals, by multinationals, by public-private partnerships. So that dimension is extremely important. So the second dimension is access to technology, but also innovation, local innovation, creating local value chains. I think as of now, when many players globally think about the continent, they think about selling technologies. They think about the continent as if, about many people or many countries on the continent as consumers. And we have seen that trend with mobile phone, for example. To what extent could they shift the perspective to really actually manufacture locally, or at least portion of it? So access to technology will be extremely important. We have the patents, so to what extent can they be, especially when you speak about technology related to precision medicine, vaccines among others. So to what extent the global community could partner to make that accessible for the continent, to create local innovations among others. So quite often people speak about technical support, but it's easy. I usually end with that because it is the easy things that people do when they don't want to actually address the most serious challenges. I'm not saying that technical support is not important, but if you provide technical support and there's no resource and no infrastructure, there's not access to technology, there's not enough investment in human capital, how universities could partner, the private sector could partner and build the most innovative, especially in the tertiary sector on the continent, and support the initiative in the primary and secondary sector by the government. So I can't expand, but I know that we are constrained with the time. So those are just very quick elements that I want to mention. And perhaps to end here, I want to express my gratitude to the Global Economy and Development Program, to the Africa Growth Initiative, to the emerging technology, the artificial intelligence and emerging technology initiative, to the global communication team, as well as to the central one, and present in the room to Sakina, to Katie, for the extraordinary work which has been done to make this possible.
Thank you, Landry. Are there other last minute, we have a minute? Are there
so 2 points
please.
On your question. I think expanding infrastructure in Africa cannot be done by public sector funding alone. Coordination with private sector is going to be critical. And also for multilaterals, I think there has to be coordination among what multilaterals do on the continent, so that sometimes to avoid too much duplication and also ensure whatever we do fits into the broader plan in these countries.
Louise, I'll give you the last word from the panel.
My last word in terms of all of this to all of the external actors on the continent: Africans got to be in charge. So let's just start there. And if we start there, I think things will move more smoothly. I would like to also echo Landry's gratitude to all of my colleagues and the staff at Brookings for making this possible. And thank you, Raj, for stepping in at the last minute and for doing such an excellent job of moderating this panel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the panelists, the authors of the report, Louise Fox, Landry Signé, our discussant, Justice Mensah. Thank you all for joining us online. We hope to see you, or hope you can see us at future events of the Africa Growth Initiative and the Global Economy Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much.